I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after weekend strikes on energy facilities in both countries leave blackouts in Russia and Ukraine, we report how Moscow now seems to be deliberately targeting Ukrainian nuclear plants well away from the front line, how Britain is sending military personnel to defend Belgian skies, and later, we have an interview with Dr Jack Watling, Senior Research Fellow for Land Warfare at the Royal United Services Institute, in which he describes Ukraine's adaptation of battlefield tactics.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 10th of November, 3 years and 261 days since the full-scale invasion began. I started with the latest military and diplomatic updates from the weekend. So I'm going to start with Pokrovsk because that's the big story that we've been looking at recently. Then I'll try and take it chronologically over the weekend. So in Pokrovsk, as ever, it's very difficult to get ground truth, but it looks like there's been no real change over the weekend. The rate of the Russian advance seems to have slowed. That's possibly an indication of the chaos in the city, not knowing who's where and whether you should open fire, etc., etc. It sounds like Russia is no longer trying to encircle the city, but rather to push their fighters in from the open southern flank and then almost squeeze Ukrainian forces out the top to be hit by drones and mortar teams that they've brought in. So concurrently, they've brought in those teams, specifically drones and mortars, as I say, to cut the logistic lines forward into and out of Pokrovsk and neighbouring Minorad. That seems to be what's happening, but as I say, it's very, very difficult to get accurate ground truth. Major Andrei Kovalev, who's a spokesman for Ukraine's general staff, he told Ukrainian media outlet Ukrainska Pravda that logistics to Pokrovsk still exist and that troops, including wounded soldiers, are being rotated in and out. But it does seem exceptionally dangerous doing that. Now, Sean Pinner, you'll remember, British guy, former Ukrainian Marine, prisoner of war, released by Russia after, how long was it, 2 years, Sean? Anyway, he's written a paper for the Centre for European Policy Analysis. We're going to put a link in the episode notes. But he's talking about the importance of Pokrovsk and why Russia is fighting so hard for it. So Sean says Pokrovsk represents a place where Russia feels it must win and where the Ukrainian armed forces are making them pay dearly for trying. He said it is not a city now, not really. It is a pressure valve, a choke point, a grinding wheel. To Moscow, it's a banner they need to raise. He says to us, as in Ukrainians, it's extra time, and time is life in this war. So the real question, Sean says, isn't why Ukraine is defending Pokrovsk, but why Russia is throwing everything it has to take it. He says the answer lies in desperation-driven optics. Now, as always, Putin needs a trophy. Russian victories have been rare, limited and paid for in truckloads of blood. Pokrovsk offers him something to point out on state TV. It's a talking point, a symbol, a narrative of progress before winter, with its mud and frost, locks the front in place. As I say, we'll put a link into the episode notes for the wider article. But Sean saying basically it's just a totemic symbol Putin is desperate to grab before winter. OK, now let's dial in on the military aspects. Overnight Friday into Saturday. Friday night saw another huge Russian aerial attack on Ukraine. Over 500 aerial weapons used. Ukraine brought down 406 of 458 drones and only nine, worryingly, only 9 of 45 cruise and ballistic missiles. Those stats come from Ukraine's Air Force. The main areas to be attacked were Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and Poltava region. That's in the centre of the country. At least 3 people were killed when an apartment building was hit in Dnipro. The images you'll see, there's a huge bite taken out of an apartment building. The 3rd, 4th and 5th floors just gone. Power plant in Chernihiv hit again. Power was out in Kharkiv. The whole city plunged into darkness. And power was still cut off across much of the country for between 8 and 16 hours yesterday, Sunday, while repairs were carried out. Svetlana Grinchuk, who's Ukraine's energy minister, said the attacks have been one of the most difficult nights of the entire full-scale war. Then on a statement on Saturday, by Ukraine's state-owned energy company Centrenergo. They said all thermal power plants are down following the largest Russian attack, which targeted all of them. Okay, now they have three. Centrenergo have three thermal power plants, one in Trylia in Kyiv Oblast, one in Zmivska in Kharkiv Oblast, and the third one in Vulyansk in Donetsk. Centrenergo said that those thermal power plants had been restored after attacks last year, with multiple drones targeting them every minute overnight, Friday to Saturday. Now, a lot of these disruptions to energy supplies were thought to be behind a technical fault that meant Ukraine's border service had to temporarily shut all border crossing points on Saturday. And on the same day, Ukraine's national gas supplier, Naftogaz, confirmed another devastating attack on gas production facilities. Also, as this was going on, very alarmingly, strikes on substations of the nuclear power plants in Khmelnytskyi, that's about 250 kilometres west of Kyiv, and Rivne, a bit further north, it's near the border with Belarus and Poland, 300 kilometres west of Kyiv. Now, these, as we said last week, it cannot be accidental. If I'm being generous, very, very generous, when we talk about hits on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, you might possibly, if you were so inclined, say that that's because of the chaos of war. It's very near the front line. It's going to get hit every now and again. We'll park that for a moment because that's not exactly how I feel about it. But let's go back to what happened over the weekend. These plants, 250 and 300 kilometres west of Kyiv, that can't be accidental. Now, Andrei Sybiha, Ukraine's foreign minister, called for an urgent meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors, saying on X, these were not accidental but well-planned strikes. He called on, quote, all states that value nuclear safety, particularly China and India, to demand Russia stop reckless attacks on nuclear energy that risk a catastrophic incident. Now, in tit-for-tat Ukrainian strikes across Russian border regions, local authorities there in Russia said that more than 20,000 people in Belgorod had been left without power, while a drone strike on Voronezh caused localised blackouts and heating cuts there as well. So we're still on Saturday. A Ukrainian battalion commander was arrested in connection, remember that Russian attack about a week ago, which killed 12 people and 7 civilians, we're now told, injured a further 36. So this individual was alleged to have organised an award ceremony in the Dnipropetrovsk region, contrary to a ban. Remember, we said that award ceremony that got hit by Russian missiles. Now then, into Russia. Still overnight Friday, Saturday, Russia had to shut down 9 regional airports because of the threat of drones, or the actual drone strikes. To describe where they are, it's easier to do it in relation to Moscow. So put Moscow in the centre of a dartboard, and the following airports were closed for various times. So you've got Pskov, that's 600 kilometres northwest of Moscow, close to the border with Estonia and Latvia. Then in Vologda region, that's 400 kilometres north of Moscow, airports in Vologda City and Cherpovets were closed. Then Ufa, that's 1,500 kilometres east of Moscow, that closed. Penza, 500 kilometres southeast, Ulyanovsk, 600 kilometres southeast, and Saratov, 700 kilometres southeast of Moscow, were all closed, as was Orenburg, 1,500 kilometres southeast of Moscow, way over on the border with Kazakhstan, and Kaluga, but that's only 150 kilometres southwest of Moscow, a mere 400 kilometres from the nearest piece of Ukrainian land, so I don't know if that actually counts. So 9 regional airports closed for various times, so long-range strikes by Ukraine, thought to be by Neptune missiles and others. They are working, they are getting through. Okay, Saturday night into Sunday, Ukrainian forces hit targets in Russia and Crimea overnight. Missiles hit the Voronezh thermal plant about 180 kilometres from the border, and other drones struck a substation near Koronovo, about 30 kilometres away from that, plus an ammunition depot in Gvardiskoy in occupied Crimea. Residents there reported hearing several explosions near the oil depot. The Kazan Orgzintez plant in Kazan, the plant in Kazan, was also reportedly hit. The Russian MOD didn't say much, just that it had shot down 15 drones over occupied Crimea, the Rostov Oblast to the east of that, and the Black Sea. They didn't say anything about things that had got through or any drone debris. Now then, Sunday, Ukrainian forces yet again hit the port of Tuapse on the Black Sea coast, just up the coast, a little bit northwest from Sochi. They hit it with maritime drones on Sunday. Unconfirmed reports suggested that at least one merchant vessel had been hit there, while alongside Pier 167. That comes from Ombre Intelligence, the global maritime risk management firm. They also say video footage showed a large explosion there, likely in proximity to the port. At the time of the attack, they saw at least 4 merchant vessels within the port, although they do note that many turn off their AIS, the automatic identification system, the pingers that let you know where everything is. But they could see at least 4 vessels in the port. Photos and videos uploaded by locals in the town and later published by the Telegram channel Astra show explosions and a resulting fire in the area of the port. Kyiv Independent says local municipal administration head Sergei Boyko had earlier posted on his official Telegram channel about this threat from both air and sea drones, but later redacted the bit about possible maritime drone attack. I bet he's regretting that now. Later on, the official Telegram channel of Krasnodar Krai, that's the Russian region, confirmed the maritime attack, claiming that 4 Ukrainian sea drones had been destroyed, but not giving any detail about what had been hit. They said one of the unmanned boats detonated near the shoreline. I'm pretty sure it did. They said the shockwave damaged the second floor windows of a 2-storey house, as well as a garage and a boat shed. Fair enough. Now, last night, Sunday into Monday, Russia launched 74 missiles and drones against Ukraine, which included around 40 Shahed-type drones and at least 2 Kinzhal ballistic missiles. Now, this comes from the Air Force reporting this morning. They said they'd intercepted 52 drones of various types across eastern, southern and central parts of Ukraine. Amazingly, only 1 person reported killed, 15 injured in the last 24 hours. Now, before I move on to the political and diplomatic updates, I should say happy 250th birthday to the US Marine Corps. Semper Fi, if I may. Right then, political and diplomatic updates over the weekend. The US-based news site Axios, citing US Department of State figures, said yesterday that the US government shutdown has delayed more than $5 billion worth of weapon exports to NATO allies and Ukraine. Deliveries of weapons to allies such as Denmark, Croatia and Poland, thought to include AMRAAMs, so that's the Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missiles, as well as Aegis combat systems and HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems, have reportedly been postponed due to the deadlock. A senior Department of State official told Axios that the US government shutdown is also slowing down congressional approvals for new weapon sales, as Department of State employees involved in this process are furloughed. The Telegraph has approached US Department of State for comment. Haven't heard anything back yet. Now, going back on his earlier tough language about countries importing Russian oil, Donald Trump has given Hungary a 1-year exemption on importing Russian fuel. Serbia's President Alexander Vučić, he's also announced that he plans to jointly with Russia request that the US suspend sanctions against his company as well, against Serbian oil company NIS. This, I think, is a worrying trend. Well, I mean, what's to stop anyone else? Why would you not ask to be exempt? India next, perhaps others. Let's see what happens with Donald Trump's sanctions plan against Russia. Okay, a couple more stories from me. There's a major anti-corruption investigation underway in Ukraine this morning. This report comes from the Kyiv Independent. They say the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the NABU, and the Specialised Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAPO, are looking into an individual called Timur Mindic. He's a former business partner of President Zelensky and the co-owner of the President's Kvartal 95 production company. Now, you'll remember back in July, the government's somewhat heavy-handed attempt to curtail NABU and SABO operations led to street protests before President Zelensky eventually backed down. The whole thing left a pretty bad taste. It was seen by some as evidence of a somewhat overbearing attitude by President Zelensky. Now, as I say, he did eventually back down, but was undoubtedly weakened politically by the whole spectacle. It raised questions, a lot of discussion about the centralisation of power and what is seen by some as his preference to rely on a small team of advisors. Anyway, according to the Kyiv Independent, their sources in law enforcement says Mr. Mindic has fled before any searches earlier today. They are said to be underway at a number of properties linked to him. Now, in a statement, NABU said a high-level criminal organisation in the energy and defence sectors has been exposed. They say this alleges corruption in the energy sector, money laundering, illegal enrichment. Now, Justice Minister Herman Halushenko, who was Energy Minister from 2021 to 2025, is also apparently subject to this investigation and being searched, according to sources. We cannot confirm these, and I'm sure the individuals would deny any wrongdoing. Now then, Britain is providing military support to Belgium after a series of suspected Russian drone incursions into its airspace, the new Chief of the Defence Staff here has said. So Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton said his Belgian counterpart had personally asked for assistance earlier last week. CDS said that equipment and personnel were now on their way. This is thought to come from the RAF's Force Protection Wing, thought to be one of the counter-UAS teams, uninhabited air system, drones to you and me. Number 2 counter-UAS from the RAF's Force Protection Wing. Now, this was in direct response to Brussels Airport that was forced to close temporarily last Thursday night after drones were spotted nearby. It's worth noting that 5 more drones were seen over Belgium's nuclear power plant near Antwerp last night, Sunday night. These RAF personnel, they have deployed previously. They deployed for the Paris Olympics last year. Comes obviously in the context of a number of drone incursions, airfields and other sites across Europe. So you might wonder why a country as big as Belgium hasn't got this kind of capability already. It's a major European country. It hosts NATO's headquarters. And possibly the reason for all this, it's sitting on the 200 billion euros of frozen Russian assets. Finally, and also on Sunday, Sergei Lavrov, we spoke about him last week. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said that he is willing to meet Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State, telling Russia's state RIA Novosti that the pair, quote, understand the need for regular communication. This comes after aborted talks last month, you'll remember. Lavrov said, that's why we communicate by telephone and are ready to hold face-to-face meetings when necessary. Comes in the wake of cancelling those potential face-to-face meetings. Anyway, Lavrov had been the subject of rumours of a rift between him and Putin last week after the Russian daily news site Kommersant alleged that Mr. Lavrov had been deliberately absent from a recent key Security Council meeting last week. So Sergei Lavrov, he's been foreign minister for more than 21 years, was supposedly chastised after a tense phone call with Mr. Rubio, which some said resulted in the abrupt shelving of a planned summit between Donald Trump and Putin in Budapest. Moscow promptly stepped in to deny any rumours of internal strife. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, speaking to reporters on Friday, said there was nothing true in them and confirmed that Mr. Lavrov would continue to serve as foreign minister. So I guess his days are numbered then. Dr Jack Watling is a Senior Research Fellow for Land Warfare at the Royal United Services Institute in London. He's worked closely with the British military on the development of concepts of operation and conducts operational analysis of contemporary conflicts. He has also worked extensively with the Ukrainian armed forces since the full-scale invasion. In a wide-ranging interview, Francis hears his perspective on the relative strengths and strategies of the Ukrainian and Russian militaries at this precarious moment of the war, which European countries could immediately cripple Moscow's shadow fleet, and a new report into the tactics deployed on the battlefield by the Ukrainian military. This is their conversation.
Well, Jack, it's great to have you back on Ukraine the Latest. We recently met each other for actually the first time, despite the fact that you've been on the podcast before, at the Frontline Club recently here in London. I moderated a panel with yourself and Chris Miller of the Financial Times and Orysia Lukasiewicz of Chatham House. And it was a really interesting evening. And I'm keen to get into some of the subjects that you talked about in that discussion. But first of all, I think it would be really helpful as somebody with such in-depth understanding of the military situation at the moment, just to hear your overview both of the Ukrainian military situation and the Russian. So perhaps we could start with the Ukrainian. Of course, at the moment, we're all talking about Pokrovsk and the significance of that sector in the front. But how important do you think that is in the grander scheme, Jack?
Well, it's good to be back with you, Francis. I think if we work from the tactical, which is what everyone's focused on in Pokrovsk, and we can build outwards, then that allows us to kind of cover the bases. So at the tactical level, first thing I'd say is it's not just Pokrovsk, right? If you look at Kupiansk, if you look at Liman, if you look at the fact that the Russians are working their way into Dnipro, starting to get into the outskirts of Kostiantynivka, there is a wide tactical problem that the AFU, the Armed Forces of Ukraine, face, which is that the Russians have worked out how to punch around the flanks of something the Ukrainians care about, and then use their mass and the diversity of fires that they have, so ballistic missiles, glide bombs, artillery, and drones, and essentially put the Ukrainians in a position where if they want to hold on to that position, they have to suffer quite significant loss of material and personnel, moving people back and forth and rotating and reinforcing the positions. And so while the Russians are not tactically competent to drive the Ukrainians off these positions by assaulting them directly, they are able to maneuver the Ukrainians off the positions by making it so costly to stay there, basically. And as the Ukrainians have become thinner and thinner in terms of the number of infantry that they have, those casualty rates are something that they have to manage really carefully. So moving up onto the operational level, there's a 1,200 kilometer front, slightly smaller, but roughly. And the Ukrainians have to defend all of it. And if they're not defending somewhere, then the Russians can just walk forwards. The Russians have more troops. They can advance on multiple axes. We saw that recently where the Russians suddenly saw an opportunity and a gap towards Zaporizhzhia, and they punched forward. And so as the Ukrainians have fewer and fewer troops due to these attritional fights, it becomes harder and harder to both cover the breadth of the front to hold the Russians back, even though the Russians are really incompetent in fighting their way through the Ukrainian positions, while simultaneously having a reserve and being able to rotate. So the operational level challenge on the Ukrainian side is a mass of infantry in the first instance. And in the second instance, for the first half of this year and the tail end of last year, the Ukrainians have been using artillery and drones in combination very effectively to cover the gaps. What we are seeing is that firstly, the Russians have caught up in terms of using UAVs. Secondly, the Ukrainians have lost access to a lot of artillery and some of the more complex fires that they've been using. And so it is also getting harder for the Ukrainians to use their fires to cover the gaps, because as the Russians have that parity in UAV capability, the Ukrainian pilots have to pull back or suffer a higher rate of attrition. So their range is reduced, etc. And so, yeah, operationally, the Ukrainians are coming under much more pressure. Strategically, it's a bit of a different picture. The Russians, on the one hand, think that they might be able to exhaust the Ukrainian army over the next year. And on that basis, they're continuing to attack. But the Russian broader plan for Ukraine is at this point to seize enough ground to basically economically invalidate Ukraine's sovereignty. So put Ukraine in a position where to be economically prosperous, they have to engage with the Russians, both to prevent re-invasion and also just to make things work. The second issue is that the Russians then want to use that economic leverage to destabilize Ukraine politically post-ceasefire and then to kind of absorb it in the same way that they have with Belarus. But if we look at the key locations the Russians have assessed they need in order to be able to get to that position, it involves not only Kharkiv, but also Kherson, Mykolaiv, Odessa, which is on the other side of the Dnipro River. And the Russians have no concept of operation or capability to be able to get across that river. And so while at the operational level, the AFU are really struggling, strategically, the Russians are still pursuing a plan which they don't even understand how they will execute it, which is a very strange situation to be in. And so the slowness of the Russian advance is advantageous for Ukraine. It gives them time.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Jack, for that overview. Just before we go into some of the points that you've just discussed, what is your assessment of the current state of the Russian military?
So the Russians have become more effective in integrating the different tools that they have in applying electronic warfare, UAVs, so drones, artillery, airstrikes, and so on. And their targeting cycle has become faster. Their ability to assess what damage they're inflicting has improved. But the Russians don't seem to care about the quality of their infantry. They don't think it's skilled work being an infantier. It's just walking forwards until you die. And so they haven't invested the time to train their infantry adequately, which means that the performance of their infantry and so their maneuver units at the front line persistently underperforms against their own timeline and objectives. And we're not talking a slight underperformance because the Ukrainians are brave. We're talking about massive underperformance. The Russian plan was to take Pokrovsk in November of last year. From a correlation of forces point of view, so if you were just analyzing the number of troops and equipment and making a reasonable assessment of what the Russian plan would look like if it was executed, the Ukrainians thought they would lose Pokrovsk in March of this year. So the Russians are more than a year behind their own schedule at this point. And we're not seeing them make any adjustments to try and fix this problem, which is a cultural issue, essentially. So the Russian military, on the one hand, is becoming more lethal. It's becoming more problematic for the Ukrainians in terms of the casualties it can inflict, but it is still failing to capitalize upon the conditions that it can create at the front. And it is losing a huge number of people in the process. Now, so far, the Russians have been replacing those losses with volunteers, driven by huge payouts to both join in bonuses and then as compensation if you're killed. There is a limited pool of people who are willing to make that offer or sign up on those terms. And so there is an interesting question, which is that if the Russians want to keep fighting this way, at what point are they going to run out of volunteers or have insufficient volunteers relative to losses and need to start compelling people into service? They have a lot more people. They don't have a shortage of people, but it's about how they get them into the army. And so far, the Kremlin has been very, very reluctant to pull those levers.
They certainly have. Well, we'll come to the Ukrainian manpower problem in a moment, because that's also very relevant to this. But just on this question of timescale, Jack, I mean, you've just talked there about how far behind schedule the Russians are in order to try and achieve those objectives you articulated. Where do you see the timescale just in terms of the next sort of 6 months, a year? How long are we going to get to from a Russian perspective before some of those factors start to fray? And we haven't even talked about the economic situation in Russia.
Yeah, so partly it depends on whether we're talking about a linear trend or a non-linear trend. If we're talking about a linear trend, which let's just say it's casualties, then the Russians can probably tweak the rules a little bit. So, for example, if you have previously served in the military, then you have reserve liability. They could use that to mobilize people without it being a general mobilization. And some of those means may allow them to even out the reduction in people coming forward to volunteer, but without them creating a political issue. And so, okay, that's something that they can maybe get them to the end of next year, and then they might have to do a forced mobilization of a lot of people if they want to fight beyond that. If they don't manage to tweak those rules, then the Russians are probably going to start feeling manpower shortages or at least strains early next year, I think is broadly the trend. If you start adding into that a Ukrainian strike campaign, which is not only increasing in effectiveness, but is also going to increase in scale and is going to expand the number of the kinds of targets it can hold at risk, because the Ukrainians are building larger payload weapons, basically, which can damage different kinds of objects to the ones they have at the moment, then the Russians could start running into a financial challenge. There's an economic stability question. And given that money is what they've been using to kind of drive forwards recruitment and military production, that starts to lead to trade-offs. And if Europe were to get serious about the shadow fleet and to start putting real pressure on Russian oil exports, then you can see a situation in which the Kremlin is facing some very difficult choices by tail end of next year, halfway through next year. Maybe moving even towards a mutually hurting stalemate, which would be the preconditions for bringing about some sort of resolution to the conflict, at least in the medium term. The flip side of that, though, is that if you just take a linear trend on the Ukrainian side, I won't be specific on when, but they are heading towards a real manpower issue and a force management problem. The good news is it's solvable, but we've known that this has been a problem for a year and a half, and sufficient interventions have not been made to address it. And so it's really a question of management rather than anything else as to whether or not we can iron out that problem on the Ukrainian side. If we can, then the Ukrainians can hold on. If we can't, things could get quite ugly.
You spoke about Western and specifically perhaps European support in the context of the Shadow Fleet. I'll come to that in a moment, because I know you had some interesting remarks to say on that the other night about what can be done that isn't being done. But first of all, when we look at the nature of American and European support at the moment, I remember reading a report by yourself back, I think it would have been about March time, something like that, where you argued about the worst case scenarios in terms of American withdrawal. And that included things that other people seemingly hadn't really considered, which is that even if they stopped giving certain types of defensive weapons, they could also be obstructive by refusing Europeans to sell on the weapons they purchased from the United States to Ukraine, and indeed cease software patches, giving spare parts, all of those sort of factors. We've avoided that worst case scenario. But where do you think we are in terms of European dependence on the Americans, and where we are generally in terms of the European ramping up of support for Ukraine? Is it where it needs to be?
So the first question is things that are manufactured in the United States, right? And there has been an issue in NATO where certain capabilities the Americans have invested in and manufactured, and therefore European countries, noting that it's a big price tag to do the development of the weapons, has basically said, we don't need an equivalent system. We're all going to just use the US one. Works pretty well. GMLRS is a good example, right? Guided multiple launch rockets. Patriot is another good example. Ballistic missile defense, really hard to do the research and development. US has poured money into it. Let's just buy the interceptors. Of course, those are manufactured in the US. Therefore, there's a question of whether the US is prepared to gift them, export them, sell them, and to who. So at a surface level, there's an issue which we can narrow down to certain classes of weapon. But if you break open a Russian missile, you will find a very large number of components in it which are manufactured in Europe and the US, because there are, at a component level, things that are critical in weapons where there just really aren't very many people who make them. And in the Russian case, they illegally obtain this stuff. In the NATO context, if you break open a European manufactured weapon, there are a huge number of subsystems and components that are derived from US companies. And if they are registered as dual use or military use components, which when we talk about high performance weapon systems, there are quite a few of those, then they are subject to US export controls. And so the US has a say on whether or not you can give the resulting weapon to Ukraine. And the US could become quite coercive or difficult over those issues. We have seen delays in US approvals of stuff being given to Ukraine that isn't American in origin. I would suggest that that is more a function of changing policy in the Pentagon, leading to bureaucratic confusion rather than a deliberate campaign to obstruct. And most of these things have been worked through, but it's caused delays. But if we look at the exposure, it's a really serious issue. And when we start looking at second and third tier supply chain problems where Europe just has disinvested essentially down the supply chain, then we are quite vulnerable. So some people take the view that, the Americans are out, we can just go alone. No, you can't. We need to manage the fact that on the one hand, US policy is diverging from European policy, but there is going to be a long tail of dependence. You can't just jump to European sovereign production of everything. And in the interim, there needs to be a sensible conversation. Now, I think that's a sensible conversation that we can have, because we can say to the Americans, look, you want us to hold down the Russia threat so that you can prioritize deterrence against China. We understand that. Therefore, we're investing in these production capabilities, and we're not buying American in these areas because these threats could be concurrent. If they are, you need your own production facility to support you. However, in order to do that and therefore reduce your commitments in this theater, we need you to make sure that everything runs smoothly on these channels. And that's a pragmatic conversation we can have, probably at a more working level. So the risk is that big P politics causes this staccato tempo of engagement where things veer left and right very quickly. And that sends very disruptive orders through our bureaucracies that disrupts what could otherwise be quite an orderly process. That's an outcome which would be very unfortunate, because it would mean that the intent is broadly there, the planning has been done, but the execution becomes a complete mess.
But is the intent and the planning there, Jack, in Europe, do you think?
So, NATO has a set of plans which defines requirements in different scenarios. They are agreed, and NATO members are now spending and putting the money in the right direction, stand fast the UK, to deliver on those plans, or at least get us on the path to delivering against those plans. There is a challenge, which is that the plans were drawn, it takes a long time to develop these plans and to get them all agreed. They were all developed under the previous administration in the US, and the US is at the center of the execution of a lot of these plans. If the US Force Posture Review, which is not yet complete, and the National Security Strategy, which is not yet published, transfers US capacity out of Europe, and that's the direction of travel, then there are some assumptions in these plans which no longer hold. And in and of itself, given time, Europe can probably plug some of those gaps. There are some gaps that we can't plug. That's a useful conversation to have with the US. But the reality is that with an American SACEUR, so Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and with the NATO process having a very heavy US presence right at the center, there isn't currently a planning mechanism to have that conversation about, how would we do this if our assumptions about the US position change? And that doesn't need to be a political decision on the US. Like if things kick off in the Indo-Pacific, China is an order of magnitude greater threat than Russia if you get into a fight. And so it's entirely plausible that through necessity, a lot of US stuff will be pulled away. So we can take our views of the Trump administration out of the equation and say there is a need to do European planning, but who's going to do it?
Absolutely. You mentioned the Shadow Fleet. I've got to ask you about what more you think can be being done on this, because you were talking about it, as I say, the other night, and your argument I thought was very compelling and is not often made enough in terms of just how profound things can shift if more initiatives were made on that front.
So the vast majority of Russian oil, which is where the Kremlin really gets its revenue from and its ready cash, goes by sea. The vast majority of their exports of oil by sea go through the Baltic Sea and therefore transit through Danish waters, the Straits of Denmark. Now, every government in Europe has a very bellicose rhetoric about we're going to crack down on Russia and degrade their economy and blah, blah, blah. And everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet apart from Hungary and Slovakia. But the reality is that as soon as you say, okay, well, here is the choke point, here's the vulnerability, let's actually do something about it, everyone starts saying, UNCLOS, international law, can't really touch any of these vessels. But when you dig into the treaty that everyone is drawing on to kind of justify not doing anything, which is it starts with the Copenhagen Convention of 1857. Basically, this was the Danes agreeing with France, the UK, Russia, Prussia, and a few other German principalities that don't exist anymore, that they wouldn't charge levies on commercial ships passing through their territorial waters. Well, we don't have to charge levies on the Shadow Fleet to, and break this convention, but you could very easily envisage all of the states around the Baltic Sea, apart from Russia, coming in this, agreeing a new convention, a treaty, which says, in order for commercial ships to enter the Baltic Sea, we require them to have insurance, to be flagged to a country, to have crew who actually have the paperwork to be like the qualifications to be able to operate the vessels, and for the vessels to meet basic safety standards, like not having their hulls rusting to pieces and, engines that don't work. Which when you're talking about oil tankers in a closed sea, you can justify on ecological grounds, right? You can say that, look, if it comes in and it's not in a seaworthy state, then this is a danger for the ecology of all of these countries. So we agree that when you approach the Straits of Denmark, you have to confirm via radio that you meet these standards. And if we have any suspicion that you don't, we are going to agree that we have the right to board your ship and check. Funnily enough, all the Shadow Fleet vessels, which are mostly like really, really old Greek ships that were sold to the Russians and are being sailed by people who are sanctioned. And funnily enough, you really only sign up to sail one of these ships if you're okay with being sanctioned, which means that a lot of the crew are not certified to do their jobs. And that's why we keep getting accidents, we keep getting breakdowns, we keep getting all this stuff. Then you can deny them access to Danish waters. And this would be a completely legal thing to do, right? So we could be more creative and deliberate about this if we wanted to. The Russians would really kick off, right? It's not a consequence-free action. But the reality is that we have a persistent problem on Ukraine where people say, we want a positive outcome. And then you go, okay, well, here is actually a mechanism to deliver on what you're saying. And everyone runs a mile. So we're not doing all we could. It's just the long and short of it.
Well, let's hope somebody's listening who has a very good legal understanding of shipping, who can get things moving on this front. We're running out of time, Jack, but I've got to ask you about your latest report for RUSI, which is called Emergent Approaches to Combined Arms Maneuver in Ukraine. Compared to the conversation that we've just had, this is a pretty granular report looking at the way in which Ukraine is fighting and some of the implications for them and indeed for NATO and international partners. I just wonder if you could summarize some of the key findings and some of the recommendations that were made in the report.
Right. So I want you to imagine that you're trying to learn to box, right?
I actually am at the moment, ironically enough. So perfect analogy.
Yeah, great. Well, do you go to somebody who's a really experienced boxer but isn't actually currently in a boxing match and get them to talk you through things and show things and, get lessons? Or do you go to someone who's on the 7th round of a heavyweight boxing match and start trying to ask them for advice, right? Funnily enough, if you were studying someone's form, technique, all that stuff, taking the video even from someone who's on the 7th round of a heavyweight boxing match, their form's probably going to be pretty degraded, right? They're going to be really tired. They're going to be doing things to compensate for hits they've already taken that you wouldn't need to do if you hadn't suffered that harm. The point I'm getting at is that people are laser focused on studying Ukraine to extract lessons. A lot of the problems that we see in Ukraine, drones, pervasive surveillance, all this stuff, are things that would manifest if we got into a fight. So it's worth us looking at the problems. But how both the Russians and the Ukrainians are fighting is not necessarily a good model for how anyone else should operate, because they are managing problems which we don't face if we're at the start of a war. At the same time, there are some Ukrainian units who have not been in the hardest place and have been given the time to train and think about how they solve some of these problems. And we are seeing that when these units are applied, they have a disproportionately successful operation. It's really only happening at battalion level. And so that's why the success of these units is not creating a massive change on the front, because we're talking about a few small units who are having localized success. But the techniques they have developed are relevant to solving the problems that we would face. And so the report is basically me having spent some time with those units, trying to describe how they conceptually break down the problem of how you get through this layer of pervasive observation and layered strike systems in order to actually take ground. There are lots of detailed conclusions about what works, what doesn't, how they use tools in combination, where they find different weapons most useful, that kind of stuff. But the argument is that the problem they're trying to address, which is how you conduct offensive action, is much closer to the problem that other NATO militaries would face. And it's also a series of considerations and techniques that are disproportionately useful for us to learn from. So we should study what those units are doing. That's the heart of the report.
Absolutely. And it's a very, very interesting one for anybody who's looking, as I say, really granularly at the situation on the ground at the moment. One point jumped out at me, actually, where it says the use of armor on the battlefield has declined over the course of the conflict. Between the 1st and 24th of August 2025, Ukrainians detected a total of only 23 Russian tanks operating within 70 kilometers of the front line, compared, for example, with 470 tanks on the southern axis in May 2023. I mean, when we talk about the changing nature of warfare, that fact alone, just buried within a very, very long report, speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It does, although it's worth noting that the Ukrainian units that are conducting successful attacks are using tanks. The Russians have now gone back to using tanks in quite large numbers. And the reason why they've done that is that little motorbikes and buggies don't work very well when there's heavy rain and dense mud. And all of a sudden, in order to maintain speed and mobility, you need a tracked vehicle. And so, I mean, what I was trying to get at in that paragraph is, on the one hand, the armor is being held much further back, which is what that paragraph is talking about. But actually, there is a narrative, which is tanks are all dead, armored vehicles and tracked vehicles in particular are useless, etc. And I have this strange dichotomy where I talk to Western analysts and people outside the conflict, and this is the narrative. And every single time I speak to a Ukrainian commander who is tasked with actually taking ground, they start talking to me about their armored vehicles and how they use them. How they use them is changing, and what they look like is changing. But we have to be this is a really good example of where we have to be careful of not taking what we're seeing on the Ukrainian battlefield for very particular localized reasons, and then assuming that that's just going to apply everywhere in all contexts in the future. Don't need tanks anymore. At the same time, how you design your tanks, how you prioritize mobility, protection, firepower, sensors, etc., is very definitely changing. Because whereas before you were trying to manage quite a small volume of hits that could actually damage you, but very, very powerful ones, which placed a huge emphasis on not being detected, for example, you are now going to be detected. And the baseline assumption is you're probably going to be hit 12 to 15 times if you use a tank. You can make a tank survivable against those hits, and the Ukrainians have, but it leads to a different design philosophy.
Well, Jack, it's been fascinating hearing your insights on almost every level, from the strategic to the operational to the political. So thank you very much for your time. We always try and ask one final question, which is there anything on your mind that we've not talked about that should be on ours? And I give you the final word.
I think there's a concern I have, which is that while the operational plan on the Russian side is quite clear, Donbass first, Kharkiv second, etc., what we've seen the Russians doing in Kherson over the river, where they can't actually attack, is what they're calling human safari, right? Where they're going and hunting civilians with drones. We are now seeing the Russians do that into Kramatorsk. They are very, very close from a range point of view to being in a position to start doing that against Zaporizhzhia, which is a major city in Ukraine. And it wouldn't take much of an advance for them to begin to do that in Kharkiv without needing or wanting to conduct a larger maneuver operation against the city. Now, the consequence of having drones going and hunting civilians in your streets is very ugly, economically disastrous, and so on. And noting that, A, we are seeing the Russians move this behavior from Kherson to other bits of the front, and B, the fact that they're close to being able to do it in some major population centers means that this is a risk that we need to get ahead of. We need to be thinking about it now. Well, not just thinking, but preparing. How do we stop that? Because it would be a really heavy blow for Ukraine.
Jack Watling of RUSI, thank you very much for your time.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.